Yep. So I was born in St. Louis and grew up right outside of St. Charles. Um, was born in 1979. Grew up in the 80s in the Midwest. So at that point, pretty much like a latchkey kid. You know, my parents met obviously pretty young. I think they were in high school whenever they were got married. It was kind of more like a shotgun wedding. So my grandfather was pretty much like, all right, hey, y'all are getting married, you know. That didn't last too long. They broke up, I would say, probably in elementary school, you know. Moved around a lot. You know, it's kind of funny. As a child, like you don't know like what your childhood is just because everybody usually in your neighborhood grows up the same way, you know. So I really didn't understand how different, I guess, my childhood was until like I went to selection, you know, to go in Green Beret. Like you start telling stories and guys are like, that's not normal. Like, no, you know what I mean? So I thought at that point it was just a culture, you know, of the 80s growing up in blue collar areas or whatever. But moved around a lot. Parents, you know, they dealt with their own. I think anybody that gets married that young and had kids, you know, dealing with alcohol, substance abuse, you know, trying to figure out what it's like to be a parent or just be an adult, you know. So after they split up, my father kind of went out of the picture for a while, and then I lived with like my grandparents for a while. My grandfather was a pretty big impact on me. He was a old Korean War veteran, so he. As soon as he got out of the war, like I don't remember him ever working for anyone else. Like he always had some kind of side hustle that he did on his own. He was a truck driver for a while. He had his own like bike shop. He built custom bikes. He was an auctioneer. Like he kind of did everything, you know. So they had a lot of influence, and we moved around quite a little bit. So I would say probably if I was in a school for more than like a year and a half, 2 years, like that was a lot. You know, it was just constantly moving from one place to the next. And I think the majority of the reason was for just because, you know, my mother was a single mother and just not having the finances, I think, you know, it was kind of like from one place to the next. And growing up, you know, was in, you know, a lot was low income housing, apartments. Flood of '93 hit in St. Louis, St. Charles, and then we were homeless for some time, living in homeless shelters and Salvation Army, and like campers. It was a pretty rough time after that. So I would say through like elementary school, I say middle school is kind of what for me is where I kind of went off the tracks, I guess, a little bit. I think, you know, puberty, you know, that kind of time frame, and I really started rebelling a lot, you know, a lot of fights. That's just kind of where I kind of, you know, you grow up, I think, at that time frame, and I don't know if it was just like the culture or the neighborhoods or what. It's like, you know, that's what I looked and see and thought what like masculinity was just like, you know, either you're an outlaw, right? You're, you know, an action hero, or you're a cop. Like those are like the three things, you know? So that's kind of where I fell into, you know? At that point, you know, started getting in trouble, hanging out with the wrong people, you know, committing, you know, selling drugs, committing crime, you know, some crime and that. So kind of went down that road quite a little bit. A lot of fights growing up. Like I said, that was just kind of the way of life, I guess, at that point, you know. It was just something that, I don't know, it was like normal to where like you would, if you were challenged or if there was an issue, like it was just a normal way of settling things, you know. For instance, I was probably in late middle school, whatever. This was right kind of whenever I met my wife. At that point, right? She wasn't my wife at that time. We were just kids. I think I was like 15, 16 years old. and we got into a altercation at a block party or whatever, and we got the bad end of it, right? And we got messed up pretty good. And then the next day, we seen one of the guys from the fight, and then so he was by himself. It was just me and another guy. So I confronted him. We got another altercation. I came up on the winning end of that one. And then the next, couple hours later, there's 3 car full of guys, in front of our house, right? It was my buddy's dad's house, right? And he's like, hey, go grab something, grab a weapon. So here I am, 15, 16 years old with a, middle-aged man. My brother-in-law now, he was 14 at the time. And then his younger brother was maybe 12 right here. I grabbed the butcher knife. I'm out in the front yard, all right, hey, let's go. What's gonna, And he was the one talking, because we were still kids, And then the guys came out of the car, and then they had bats and all this other stuff. And then obviously at that point they're like, these guys, there's something wrong here, Luckily nothing happened, The conversation, kind of spilled, but that was normal kind of things, as a young kid, it was nothing out of the norm from a 14, 15, 16-year-old kid fighting a 40-year-old man, I don't know if that was just the 80s, the Midwest, or just the time frame. I don't know. But yeah, so that was kind of the culture of growing up at that time. And then I met my wife. I was living outside of St. Charles, and I was getting a lot of trouble, and then they would move me out to the country, right? So I moved out to the country from there. And then got out there, and I met my wife there at a bus stop there out in the middle of the country. She lived in the city also, but she moved out there. And we started dating at that time, kind of what kids do, And then still getting in more trouble, right? A lot more fights and that. And they're like, all right, hey, we're going to try to send you somewhere else. So they sent me over to my grandfather's, and he was the one I was talking about. Had a lot of influence in my life. And so stayed with him for some time. And then same thing, hey, all right, stayed there for about a year or so. I actually learned a lot from him, learned a lot from my father also. Whenever he kind of came back in my life, I kind of came back with him, and was living with him for actually a summer. And man, I was probably 10, 11 years old, kind of when he started coming back. And he used to put me on the back of a trash truck, and I'd get 3 o'clock in the morning. He put me on the back of the trash truck, and we'd haul trash all summer long. And it's kind of crazy, looking at it now, and seeing a young kid, probably maybe 12, And then somebody ended up calling either the Child Protective Services or something, hey, listen, you can't have this kid. This was early 90s. I was born in 79, so 92 maybe, something like that. And so instead of them taking me off the route, he just put me in the front of the cab. So every time we stopped and had to get had another house to serve, I had to get out of the car, go and grab the trash and throw it in the back. So, but he's the one that really kind of, I think him, my grandfather, instilled that kind of discipline, that grit, that kind of resilience, that drive. I would say that portion there. And then, we would go out hunting, and really kind of got my interest in firearms at that point, so he kind of set the tone for that portion there, especially later on in my military career. But came back, and I was actually, I left there for a while, and then ended up getting back into the country and living where my grandmother was at. And me and my now wife started coming a little bit more of a thing. I was actually living with her. I didn't have anywhere to stay. Her parents, because I was friends with her brother. And so I was friends with her brother. Her parents were letting me stay there. And then behind closed doors, me and their daughter were like seeing each other, And once they found out about it, they're like, absolutely not, you know. The fact that they even let me in there to stay there, you know, says a lot about them. But they're like, absolutely not. So like they're getting ready to move her back to Texas, and we're like, all right, we're just gonna move away, you know. And they're like, hold on, stop, don't do that. And so we ended up, we're like, all right, but they're like, hey, you can't stay here. So that pretty much forced our hand. We moved out, and we actually, this is a story. So we bought a house. I think it was like 18, 19 years old. We bought our first house at 18, 19 years old. And I had to tell people that story, and they're like, oh, that's amazing. I'm like, no, this place was a shithole. Like there was no, like the flooring wasn't there. There's like plaster coming out the walls, you know, off the walls. It wasn't like, I think we paid 18, 19,000. It was under 20 grand for the house, you know. But we didn't have the money for it. And there was a small bank there in that town that let us get the loan, you know. And I was just working. I don't even remember what job. I was just working some blue collar job at that time, you know. So like I was really appreciative of that, because without that we would have never been able to get that. And then so from there, you know, I'm doing, you know, odds and end jobs, you know, but I'm still like, anytime, you know, there was something where I can make money off the side, was not really legally sound, like I was still doing it, right? And then, but at this point, we already have, you know, me and her, we already have 2 kids, right? So we had kids really young. And I'm like, man, this is not, like, I can't, like, you know, there's a point to where I'm like, the cycle is just going to keep on continuing, right? Like somebody's got to break the cycle. Like somebody's got to get us out of there. So I'm like, you know, the military, that's my way out, you know? So I talked to, you know, I'm like, hey, let's join the military. I'm going to join the military, you know? And then went up there, went to the recruiter, signed up. And then from there, we got married like right after that. I did the delayed entry program for the military, and then shipped off, went to basic training, kind of did all that. And then I got to my unit actually 1 year before the towers, September 11th of 2000, like right before the Twin Towers hit. And then when the towers hit, we were out doing training at at like an obstacle course, right? And then the towers hit, and you know, I remember that, like, there's certain things, you know, throughout your life, you know, you remember, like, that's kind of what was one of them, because we're like, you know, I joined before combat, you know, and then now this happened, you know, like now the reality is like, okay, something's going to happen here, you know. Go back to the unit, and then we end up deploying to Qatar, right? And I sit at a gate for like 10 months, right? And I remember sitting there, and we're in Qatar, and one of the entrance there is like where all the SOCOM personnel came out. That's like, you know, you got your Green Berets, your Rangers, your NSW, Navy SEALs. MARSOC wasn't in the game yet. There wasn't kind of there at that point yet. But like all of those guys are coming through. So I'm seeing these guys going out on combat operations and coming back, you know, and I'm like I feel like I can be doing more. Like you're seeing that stuff, you know. We come back to the States, and then Iraq kicks off. And I'm like, all right. So we deploy with Iraq, but we're in like the flot. We're behind the flot, like the 4 line of troops, right? And so as we were going through, like we wasn't seeing much combat. Like we weren't seeing anything really at that point. But we was attached to an ODA, and I was like, these guys were out like getting after it, you know? And I'm like, before I joined the military, I really didn't know what Green Berets or Rangers or any of that stuff is. Like, you know, I really didn't pay attention to it. You know, I just thought everybody in the military does the same shit. Like, you don't know. And so I see these guys, and I'm like, man, these guys are getting after it. Like, that's what I want to do. So as soon as I come back from that trip, I prep for selection, and then I'm like, all right, I'm going to selection, you know. And then once I got back, prep for selection, I left for selection, and then I went to selection. I think it was October of 2004, and did that for Selection was, first you go to selection, you come back, and then they go to the Q course. But at that point, like, you're talking to people there, and like, you kind of start telling your story there, and that's where you're kind of like, oh, that's not normally not everybody had the same experiences. Some guys had some pretty crazy though, like really stories, like, you know what I mean? Especially people going in the military. I think they've pretty persistent, or resistant, So I did that. I came back, and then I found out, like, some guys were telling me, like, hey, listen, before you go back to your unit, like, normally in the military you get what's called like leave, right? So after you graduate the Q course and I earned my Green Beret, right? I went to seventh group, right? 7th Special Forces group, and instead of taking my 45 days leave, I just went straight to the unit, right? Because I was trying to get there because I knew the war was going on, and I wanted to try to figure out I knew if I did that, I might be able to get into a company sooner than the guys that were graduating at the same time. So I went there. I got there, got to the unit, and they're like, hey, the leadership, the command sergeant major hasn't put anybody anywhere yet. He's like, where do you want to go? I'm like, well, I don't know what battalions are what. Like, I don't know the difference, And they're like, well, 1st Battalion is going to Afghanistan. Do you want to do that? And I'm like, yep, sign me up, So go over to 1st Battalion. They were doing a train up when I got there. And so they were training up already for Afghanistan. And once we got back from that training, they already had their teams full, right? One guy came off, so luckily it opened up a spot for me to get in to get on ODA and deploy. And I will tell you, like, I thought I was a tough kid until that initial, like, troops in contact. And I'm like, whoa, like, this is real. This isn't the same thing, This isn't like, this is different, And we deployed to that trip. We deployed to the Helmand province in Sangin Valley, and it was the Wild Wild West up there, But luckily, like, I was on a really, really good ODA, a lot of solid senior leadership that was on that team, and those guys were good, solid dudes, But yeah, it was pretty tough trip, right? We were there for about 10 months, seeing quite a little bit of a lot of combat. The ODA, like, we had it to where ODA was in, like, near ambushes, to where, we were getting engaged by enemy personnel, from here to where that, the sign is over there, within 50 meters. That's one thing about combat, like, I'll tell guys, especially trying to talk to, like, especially personnel that have never experienced, it's not like the movies, right? Like, you see in the movies where somebody's being shot at and they're like, oh, it's coming from over there, right? Like, the combat's like a 360, right? So it takes a long time where guys being shot at before you start actually understanding where rounds are coming from, right? Because there's a certain distinctive sound, like when rounds are whizzing past you, that it takes a long time of being getting shot at before you're like, oh, okay, I have a general direction of where it is, right? And, when you do the training, it's where it's important. I tell these young guys, it's like, that's why it's important to have what we call them range cards, right? Is where, like, you're knowing, so if I stop at a certain location, right, and I go, okay, hey, this is the enemy location, I'm gonna go figure out exactly how far from me to where that building is, right? So then I know, hey, from here to there is 600 meters. So I know what can be engaged, what weapon system can be engaged from that point. Okay, RPG can shoot from here, PKM can be accurate. Okay, hey, let's back up 400 yards. Now we're out of distance. Now we can engage them, and there is not accurately engaged. Like, a lot of this stuff, that's why, like, I tell guys, like, attention to detail is so important. Like, in combat, like, how you set your rounds up, like how you do everything is very, 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 very important. But during that trip, one of our an ODA that we was with, my ODA was 726, and ODA 725 was with us, and they lost one of their guys. They were in the same fire base with us. Another great solid team, but was during an operation up towards Musa Calais. That trip there, telling war stories, I say this all the time, there's a right and a wrong way to tell war stories. And what people don't understand is when you start telling like these war stories, there's so much emotion that is involved with it, right? We're talking about, people have lost their father, their son, their husband, and I'm very careful, like as I'm telling stories, because all the guys that I serve with, you start getting up here and you start telling stories, you have to make it about, like, you have to do it with some kind of honor, and you can't, it's very hard to because there's no way I can come over here and I start talking about all kinds of cool guy shit that I did. And every one of my teammates that's there and everybody I served with in combat is going to be like, they did just as much shit as I did, right? And they're going to look at this and be like, there's going to be a tinge of like jealousy, right? And you're like, man, I don't want to lose a friendship or whatever over something, whatever, because it's taken in the wrong context, And then, then people's family has to see it, So it's tough, man. I did one for the Special Forces Association. Our ODA did a thing to where they called us up. We had one operation that we did, and it was a CSAR, which is a recovery. We were in the Helmand. It was during this trip, and a Chinook was shot down a couple hundred meters from our location, right? And so we had to go to the crash site, secure the crash site. We took heavy contact, and the ODA had to recover the personnel that were in the crash site, And I was getting drilled quite a little bit, and I really wasn't saying a whole lot, And not because I didn't, but because there was cameras, right? And I didn't want to talk about certain things, right? That were like, these were were taking out remains, and those are somebody's family, And one of the reporters kept on pushing me and on that, and I'm like, no, I'm not saying it, man. I was pretty adamant about it. And here she comes, man. They brought the family out. Like, it was like some Jerry Springer, like the wife and the kids, man. And I'm just like, man, I just kind of like lost it, I was pretty upset about it, So I kind of went off camera, and I just went over there and just started talking to them, and I was like, I'm done, And then I went over there. I think we forget about the human domain sometimes when we tell these stories, So I try to be very cautious of that. But yeah, so that was a tough trip. Once we got back, I was back for about 6 months. I went to sniper school during that time, and then went back to the same location again and did another 10 months. During that trip, it was supposed to be, we were supposed to come back before Christmas, and they kept us there past Christmas time frame, right? And I was like, what the, because I don't know the thought process behind it. So we stayed there again that next trip, and then we came back after Christmas. But during that trip was another tough trip for us. And then we ended up losing our team sergeant during that trip. Mitch Young was killed, and then 2 of our other guys got injured, and then we had to have replacements come in during that trip. So, but like, I go on like that so my first 20 years of while I was in the military, I was almost deployed TDY away from my family almost 11 years. So gone, didn't see my wife and kids for almost 11 years of the first 20 years. Like, that's a very, very difficult thing to ask your family to do. And it comes with a lot of sacrifice, not just for the people who serve, but for what we expect of their families. It's tough, So I did that for, almost 24 years, was, active duty for 24 years. And then you go on these trips and you experience this, and you come back and you're like not the same person. There's a certain hardness that you have to have. There's a so for instance, we had a guy that was on another ODA who had a picture like of his family like on his gun truck, and he just crumbled. He could not keep. You almost had to put all of that out of your mind, and you only have to focus on what you're there to do. Because if you start like thinking about like family and everything else, then you can't do your job effectively. And then you're putting your guys you're in combat with life's at risk because you're thinking about home and family and everything else. Now there are trips that weren't as bad where you could have that, but there were trips I was on. It was like there was no time and place for it, because it was pretty hectic. Those 2 trips there, it was going outside the wire, troops in contact for 4 to 7 days, coming back, refitting, going out and do it again. We got the resupply really linked up, and then we'd get resupply birds come in, and then we'd go out there and we'd stay out there longer. But yeah, we were running and gunning for a long time there. So those trips were tough. Then we come back, and towards the end of my deployment, at my end of my career, I ended up getting promoted through the ranks. So like as you're moving, I don't think you have time to stop and think about that stuff, right? You just like, it's good, you kind of like, I'll deal with it later. Then the next deployment comes or the next leadership position comes, and then you just never deal with it, and you just keep on moving through. Whenever I was a team sergeant, I really enjoyed that position. The camaraderie with the ODA was like really good. Had a lot of really solid guys on that team, and was able to really build, I believe, a culture around those guys. That's one thing. When I talk about like leadership, is you have to have buy-in from the guys you're with. I think a lot of people, they get this false perspective that like leadership is telling people what to do. It's not. It's helping people get to where they need to be, right? Like you're there to serve them. So for instance, instead of like coming in and telling the guys like, hey, this is what our standards are, is just talking to them. Hey, what do you think what do you think our ODA a guy on our team should be able to do? And they would answer it, right? And you're like, okay, that's the standard. Same thing as whenever we went out and done combat operations. It was to a point to where instead of me or the team leader or whatever is telling them, hey, this is exactly what we're going to do, is you do planning with them, and they help develop the plan, right? So now when you're out and your troops in contact and you're in shit, they're not questioning it, because I'm like, hey buddy, this is just what your plan was mine. You know what I mean? Like we did this together. Like that's how being part of a team like is. But I continued moving through the ranks. Became a first sergeant. Did that, and then like I probably would have stayed in forever. They probably would have had to kick me out, but then got promoted to sergeant major, and then during that time, me and my wife, we were coming back. It was our 20-year anniversary, and we were coming back from Maui. Like COVID was just kind of kicking off, and then we got back, in the company that I was taking over, that company were coming back from Afghanistan, and they had a hard trip, and they lost 3 guys from that company. And I was already like in position, but I hadn't met anybody from the company yet. And then I get a phone call that our son was in a motorcycle accident. And it was I didn't know what the status of it was at first, but but I was in the kitchen, and I just went to my knees, and I'm like, I just felt like something wasn't right, you know. So I started going to the hospital. On the way to the hospital, and I'm like thinking, you know, do I call my wife? Like, I don't know what the status is. Like, what do I do? We get there, and there was a cop outside, and then there was a nurse there, and I'm like, hey, our son is here at the hospital, and he's like, you can't come in, and I'm like, I lost it, and I was like, he's like, hey, you know, if you don't calm down, like, we're gonna take you into jail, and I was just like, luckily there was a couple ladies that came out from the hospital and was like, hey, no, let him in. So we go inside, and we're sitting there. It was me and my wife, and then they come back, and they're like, hey, would you like to go see him? Like, he didn't make it. And so, I went back there, and like held him, and then obviously, I mean, it was tough.
How old was he?
He was at 23. And so we went back to the house, and then now we got to tell our other kids, you know. And it was really tough, really, really tough. So, and this was like COVID was going on, and like, so my wife was like, hey, like, I want to have like a funeral. I want his kids, I want his friends to see him. Like, I want to have a funeral, you know. And so like we went to the first funeral home, and they're like, hey, listen, you know, we can't do it. And then so we went to the next one, and I'm like, you know, talking to this, and I'm like, hey, listen, man, I will have the whole ODA, the whole company will hear. Like, I will, whatever precautions like you need, like, I will make sure it happens. If you want everybody in, whatever you need, like, you want everybody separated, I will have personnel doing whatever precautions you need, you know. And you know, this was just at the beginning, so nobody really knew. So it wasn't like
because of COVID.
Yeah, because of COVID, right? And then so they let us have the funeral. So we had the funeral there, and then man, like, this is the hardest thing for me, man. It's like, I think there's a time when you deal with trauma so much, you find a way to deal with it, either positive or however you're dealing with it, right? And then for like the last, like, all these years, I would just put it aside and then just go on to the next thing, right? And I'd done that for so long, and now this happened, and I'm like, I don't know how to react. Like, I don't know how to grieve. I don't know what to go forward. Like, there's no, how do you do this, you know? And so we ended up going back to work like way sooner than we probably should have, probably within like 2 weeks, right? And because I'm like, I don't know what to do, you know? And then I'm like thinking in my mind, I'm like, you know, we got our kids, like, I can't lay in bed. What am I going to lay in bed for? Like, you know what I mean? I got to do something. I got to show these, you know, show our other kids that we have to, you know, persevere forward, you know? And so yeah, so I went back to work, and I would say I was a company sergeant major for about 2 years, and man, I was just treading water, you know, like just push things to the side, and then trying to like deal with it. But at that point, man, I really wasn't doing PT much anymore, right? And I was really kind of just treading water, you know. If it wasn't for the guys that was in the company, they like I felt like they needed me, you know. I probably would have collapsed a lot sooner, you know. So So dealt with that for about 2 years, and the company was getting ready to go back and forth. Like whether they're going to go to South America, and then all of a sudden they were going to go to Afghanistan again. And I'm like, man, I just lost my son. I'm getting ready to go back to Afghanistan, And
How did your marriage handle all this?
oh man, we were like, at that point, there was turmoil, right? Like me and my wife, I think there's certain things like they say, that like marriages don't last through, right? And man, we've hit. We're checking the blocks on a lot of them, right? Being in the military, being gone that long, like losing a child, like all these things. It's like there's no way that like a 1% chance, so it was going through turmoil, but we were just kind of keep going through and just kind of going through the motions, But she didn't know I was slotted to go to Afghanistan. Like I didn't tell her yet because I didn't even know how to say anything to her, And so I'm like dealing with that, and and then the withdrawal of Afghanistan happened because we were supposed to go right before they withdraw, and that withdrawal happened, and that total, shit show debacle, and so then that withdrawal happened, and I go into my leadership's office like the next day, and I'm like, I'm done. I'm out, And at that point, he pulled me out of position, and kind of once he pulled me out of position, I would say that's when everything really went for a downhill like turn, Like I said, I'd already kind of went away, not doing PT. Like I was drinking too much. Like I was barely getting out of bed. So our Jacob, he used to build Legos. Like he was really into Legos, and like I had never built Legos in my whole life, and for Christmas that year after he passed away, I was like, hey, I told my oldest son, hey, what do you want for Christmas? I said, hey, I want a Lego set, and so he ended up getting me the one of the sets he asked. I was like, hey, the Winnie the Pooh set, the one. There's like a story behind the Winnie the Pooh. World War I, the guy came back. The whole premises of like him making that cartoon characters was to show his son how he dealt with the trauma of World War I. Talked about the different characters, about how they deal with anxiety and fear and, all these things, right? So he ended up getting me that set. So every year for on Christmas Eve, we exchange Lego sets and build Legos. But I would say for months, like I probably bought like every Lego set that you could buy, right? Like the houses, and I had a huge city just where I built Legos for like months, and like trying to get out of my head. Like as I was getting out, like I was on probably 15 different medications. Like everything, they just feed you like, oh, you got this problem, here's another medication. You got this problem, here's another medication. So like I was on this downhill spiral trying to figure out kind of where I was at, what I was going to do, And then at one point I'm like, all right, enough is enough. I got to do something, Like I just can't live my life like this, And so I'm like, all right, I got back to what I knew, and then I started going back to the gym, And I'm like, I know that, So started going back to the gym, and as I'm doing that, I'm like, all right, I really need to deal with some stuff. So I started going to see a therapist, right? And I was going there doing that, and then talking to them and trying to like deal through some of that stuff, but also like stay positive, right? I think when you go to a therapist, I'm not saying you don't want to deal with your problems and like deal with it, but there comes a certain point where it's like, all right, I got to move forward positively and not sit there and talk to somebody about all this negative shit that's happening to you, because that's all you're going to focus on, right? Like your brain is like wired to like, you think about positive and gratitude things, then you start. So there's a point to where you got to go forward, right? So that's what I was really focusing on when I was doing that. Me and my wife started going to marriage counseling. Then she started going to counseling herself. And like I'm doing all these things, like I'm, reading on parenting, like I was really into stoicism. So like I was as a team sergeant, so I was like learning looking at stoicism and all that stuff. And I'm starting to like kind of come out of it, right, a little bit. But I couldn't get rid of like this anger that I had, like this bitterness, the anger that I had was just overwhelming, and sometimes,
what were you angry at?
like anybody and everything, like, so you serve all this time. So first I was angry. You put everything into your military service, right? Serving your country and people there, and then it stops. And then you're no longer needed anymore, right? You know it's going to happen. You just don't know how you're going to react to it once it happens, right? I had a hard time going back on the compound because I was pissed off there. I was angry with just being around people, just because another thing I think a lot of people don't understand, at least I think with a lot of veterans, is you live this whole life of selfless service, and then you see other people living in their own world, and they don't care about their fellow man, and like, you know what I mean? And you're sitting there like, bro, put your card away. Like, you know what I mean? Or like, be considerate of other people. And it's overwhelming whenever if you can't let that control like where you're at, So there's a lot of anger there. And a lot of times too, I would say, and what's funny is, so in combat or any kind of like things where there's like violence like that ensues, there's a fight or flight that kicks in, right? But if something happens as a perceived threat, I decide, okay, am I going to fight or am I going to flight, right? So if my natural reaction is to flight and I get to do that, or I got to fight, right, then that anxiety doesn't kick up. Actually, I'm really calm, cool, collective. There's not an issue. But then when you get into the real world and somebody disrespects you, gets in your face, it's not socially acceptable to bust them in their mouth. So now you have to be like, now you go into a point to where like your body is saying, hey, it's time to fight. Your mind says it's time to fight, but now you're fighting against that because you're like, nope, the right thing is pull back, and then you have this anger, right? Like for me, that is like the biggest, like the best way to kind of explain like what I was dealing with, So I was like, me and my son were going to the gym together, and I'm like, hey, man, let's start going to church, right? And I started going to church. Me and him together, and I was going to, every church I was going to, I'm like finding a reason not to like it. I was going and I'm like, no. I'm very big into like not being hypocritical, and I'm just judging. I'm like, nope. We went to every church in our town, and I started talking to my daughter, who had some positive influences with where she was working, and she had some positive influences that were in the church at that point. And I was like, hey, you want to start going to church with us? I'm like, hey, we're trying to find a church. And then she's like, yep. She started going, and then my wife, eventually started going with us. And she was really kind of like, it's hard when you talk about all of this whenever you lose a son, right? So we ended up finding a church we really liked, and then I started going into like the small groups, and it's like a men's small group, whatever. And that like originally was really, I'll tell you, it was be 100% like honest. It was weird for me for a while, right? Because I was like, these aren't guys that I'm normally used to being around. Like these guys aren't the pipe hitting savages that I'm normally like with, and but they have something that I don't, like you can make fun of Ned Flanders and Simpsons all you want, but like the guy, you know what I mean? I'm like, I could be mad at that, but I'm like, man, he's got something I don't have. Like I want a little bit of that. Like I don't want to be in the place where I'm like angry and upset and all that all the time, right? So I started going to that for a while, and then I started really just getting into scripture, like reading scripture the same way. Originally, I just started reading scripture the same way I kind of read like Stoicism, right? And I started really seeing a lot of practicalities on like how, like as you're reading scripture and then putting it into your life, right? Then now you start having this fight because I'm a logical thinker, right? I'm like, okay, well, how can I, at some point, logically, right? If I go, everything that I see is made by somebody or something, right? So like at some point you're like, if everything's made by somebody, we didn't just take that camera and throw it up in the air and it came back and became a camera, right? So somebody created it. So how is it crazy that we don't have a creator that created everything else here, right? So logically, to me, I'm like, I don't see any other option how that is any other case, you know? Then you start reading scripture, and now you got to go into, okay, now I'm looking at scripture and I'm reading it and I go, okay, Jesus Christ, right? How do I, if I can say, okay, there's a creator, right? Then I go, okay, because you have all these other different religions that you can look at, right? And I go in there and I start reading scripture and then I start looking at it logically, and I'm like, I have done, nobody is going to, I know nobody who will lie to a point to where they will be, killed for a lie. And 12 people aren't going to do that, right? You can't find 2 people that'll do that, 1, let alone, right? And then I'm like, okay, so let me start reading into it. And then as I'm like using and reading scripture and apply it into my life, and I'm like, and things are marriage is starting to get better. My relationship with my children are starting to get better. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's what really kind of pulled me. And I'm like, all right, I'm going to go all in. If you can help like take this like anger and this hate and this violence that I've lived with my whole life, then I'm all in, So that's where we're at, like, kind of right now. And that's where I think it's really kind of pulled me out of everything, and then the one thing, I talk to a lot of people about where they get really hung up on like purpose, because there's an argument that you have to really get around is, well, why do all these bad things happen if there's like a God? Like, why would a God like do that, right?
That's a great question.
Great question. A lot of people ask that question, and I'm like, man, you can't have your cake and eat it too, man. Like, so you can't have free will and then not have bad things happen, right? So there is a design that we have that our creator made, right? There's a base design that we have, and it's hard to like argue that we aren't like spiritual people, that we want something. We want a creator. We want a bigger, higher power, right? Depending on who you choose, but it's designed in us, right? Now, if I say there's a creator, right, and I say he gives us free will, then bad things are going to happen. Now, well, why doesn't he stop it? Well, why don't you let your kids eat ice cream every morning? Because it's not good. I don't know. Like, you know what I mean? Like, there's at some point you have to understand that there's knowledge there that we don't know. We're never going to know. Like, so you have to either be okay with that, or you're going to rack your head around like this question of like, why do bad things happen? Well, bad things happen because we're in a fallen world and we have free will, right? So now and there's a thing where like, well, can miracles happen? Well, yeah. Well, if a creator can create all of this, can he stop something bad from happening? Of course he can. When that happens, I don't know. You don't know. You can make assumptions, but we don't really know. You know what I mean? So, but I think people get wrapped around once they start kind of really diving into scripture and they see in context about something happened to some person in a historical way, does not mean that that's going to happen to you, So, but yeah, man, like, so I really did a lot of self-reflecting on a lot of things and kind of really pulled into it and how that applied to my life and kind of where I'm at.
And it helped you kind of deal with losing your son and all
Yes, it helped me a lot deal with it because
probably some PTSD too from military.
Yeah, it helped a lot from the trauma from the military and from that, and it just kind of, it's hard to explain. It's like a blueprint on how to live your life, you know. And I got guys, so I do coaching consulting, and I got clients that are atheists, and I go, hey man, just use an open heart, read it. There's one thing to be an atheist. There's one thing to like not read it to see. You know what I mean? Because if you read it and you start looking into it and you just take the principles and apply it to your life, you see, there's people out there right now that you look at, the exact principles that they apply to their life is exactly what's in Scripture, but they just leave God out of it. Mm-hmm. They'll sit there and they'll tell, hey, porn's bad for you, right? Obviously, yep. Be grateful, right? Serve others, like, you know, like be with one woman, like all these things that like, they're like the key to success is there. Guess where they're from? Like they're in Scripture, you know. Now there are times where you can take things out of context, right? That's the one thing that's why religions break and fracture and everything else. But I think a lot of people listen to religion and don't get into like the Word and kind of try to understand it.
I think it's the organized structure of religion that turns off a lot of people.
Turns off a lot of people. It turns off me.
Turns me off.
Turns so many people off because this is the problem.
It seems these churches seem out of touch with.
So this is what happens.
World.
This is what happens, and this is what people kind of need to like look at to a certain point. And it took me a while to wrap my head around it because I was in the same spot, right? That's why I went to all these churches, and I'm just like the hypocrisy that's there, and I'm like, then the gossip. You know, I'm better than you, like all that kind of things that was like turns people off. But you have to understand, those are people. People are sinners. Like, you know what I mean? Like there's no church that you go to that are not going to have sinners in there, that are not going to have people that are judgmental. I'm going to tell you something. Churches are filled with people going to hell. You know, I've met more recovering addicts that are way better people than people I've met at church. Right? So you have to but I think people get wrapped up that will turn people off from church. And I go to church because I think there is something about community, going to church as a community. But I think it's more important to get into Scripture and understand that and try to live your life through Christ and focusing on that versus getting wrapped around all the bad shit we do as humans in the church, right? Because the church is made up with people. Truthfully, the Scripture was written for people in church, calling people in church hypocrites and all that stuff where they're judging people. They're not judging to non-Christians. They're not talking to atheists. They're talking to people that are Christians, right? That are, you know, say I go to church and everything else.
So you and your wife are now church-going people? Yeah,
we go to church. But I still struggle.
But were you churchgoers before?
No. So I would say I was a Christian, but I was a Christian, right? I had some influence. My grandmother brought me up in church. My dad's grandmother took me to church a little bit. But when I was a kid, never really went to church. That was the only time I had any influence on it. My grandfather, he came over here. He was in like a foster home, not a foster home, but like a missionary. What is it? All Catholic nuns were there. What were those things? I can't remember what they're called or whatever. You know what I'm talking about? Like whenever they're like old school, like foster home where nuns were running it. Like that's where he was. And he did not like religion, and he was not, the Catholic Church. He was not a fan of it all. Right? He was very against it. Right? He had some bad experiences there in the.
But would you say you lived your life in line with the beliefs that
No, I live my life in the beliefs of I'm the number one in control and what I do works. Like I did not. I got baptized before we went into Iraq. I went and got baptized Catholic. But at the same token, they're like, "Hey, do you believe in this?" I'm like, "Yep." I was checking the boxes. You know what I mean? And And I was at a point to where like, if this thing is real, let me check these boxes. So just in case I do get killed, maybe I'll go to heaven. Like that's kind of where I was at.
But do you think if you had not lost your son, you'd be going
Probably
to church?
not.
Probably not.
Probably not. I would probably, I think there's some people that need to, I was at a point to where like I was willing to try like almost anything to try to like
Save your marriage?
make myself better, to help my marriage get better and help my kids get better. And like all these things that I thought I was doing, that I was checking the box for, that like, okay, hey, this is what I'm supposed to do. Oh, this is what this book says. Okay, boom, execute it. And I'm doing it. And I'm just like, and it still isn't working, So yeah, it was, if it wasn't for that, yeah, because that whole time I was living like a savage. Like, you know what I mean? I was leaning on my own self to accomplish things. And I was not, I was a sinner to say the least, and I wasn't living my life according to that at all, Only I'd say I came into my faith within the last year and a half, maybe 2 years. And it's been a tough road still, I still struggle, and I'm still questioning things too at times, like I think if you're not wrestling with it, then are you really trying to live? Like, are you really trying to follow it? This is what I do know. I know when I started aligning myself with Scripture and started glorifying God, started living like Christ, my life dramatically improved. And I had conversations even with my wife, and she's like, hey, you're changing. And I'm like, do you want me to go back to the old guy? And she's like, nah, So I'm like, okay, So
It says a lot about you and your wife that you guys survived everything you went through.
Oh man, like that's what I tell, I tell people all the time. It's like, I'm not saying my life is far from being perfect, right? But I want people to know that you can get through it if you choose to get through it, if you make a choice to get through it. And I'm not saying that I'm not going to have struggles a year or 2 years from now, but I'm going to choose to work through them whenever I have it. Like, that's the thing that people don't get. Like, there's this point to where something bad happens, and the more resilience that you build, the more flash, the bang that it has, the more like something bad happened, or I'm in a bad spot. Now, how long is it going to take me to fix it, right? But people wallow in their sufferings longer than they should, and not try to feel grateful for it, right? And then and I've watched some of your stories, man. There's some crazy stories, like crazy stories. And there's always a story that I can look at and I'll be like, I'm not that bad. I can always find something that I'm like, I need to be grateful, because there's always somebody that's had a way worse start than you did, But I will tell you, from my experience, from people that has get past that when they had those tough stories, once they get past it, and if they can break those chains, man, they're some of the best people you'll ever be around, Like all the guys that I've served with, that I know now, that are my friends, that I would call friends, that have had some of the most difficult stories, are always some of the best people, because they've learned how to be resilient. Yeah. They understand what love is because they've lost it. They understand what it means to have nothing, so they're grateful for where they have anything. Like these people talk about, it's like, oh, you got it. I feel sorry for the person who's born into money, because to me, you will never, ever, ever be able to experience what I experienced and what somebody has nothing experienced, right? Like, that's gratitude that, like, once you realize that. So when I went to SEER school, right, and it's like the survival school where you don't eat for like a week, like no food, just water or whatever. Like, after I finished that school, like a burger never tasted so good in my life. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you have to do without before you're ever going to have any like joy into what you have.
All the adversity makes you a better person.
All the adversity makes you it can make you bitter if you let it.
Yeah.
Right? But if you can figure out how to tap into that gratefulness, like, I survived, like I made it through this,
Yeah,
So,
it was nice to hear some people who've climbed out of the
yeah,
toughest spots in life.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
All right. Terry, thank you so much for sharing your story.
Yeah, no worries, man. Appreciate
Good luck
it.
to you and your wife.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate
Thanks.
it.
When I was designing the first Soft White Underbelly book, I realized that there were so many great portraits that weren't going to make it into that book. They just wouldn't fit. And once I saw how well that first book sold, I knew I'd have to design a second book. This second book is finally ready to ship. Like the first one, this book has a collection of some of the best portraits from Soft White Underbelly, accompanied by a quote from that person's interview. This book features another group of Rebecca portraits, as well as a collection of color images of the Whitaker family, and plenty of others. You can order yours for $125 or $150 for a signed copy at softwhiteunderbelly.org. Again, like the first book, once this book is sold out, I will not be printing more of them. The portraits are what Soft White Underbelly is all about, and these two books contain the best of all that work. Thank you for watching.